The cameras were rolling, the lights were hot, and millions of people were watching. What happens when a future king decides that silence is no longer an option? Because what unfolded on that live broadcast wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't emotional in the way people expected. It was calm, measured, almost surgical. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And that's what made it terrifying. For years, the public narrative had followed a familiar script. Interviews, documentaries, carefully chosen words, emotional confessions, carefully framed grievances. A story that many accepted at face value and others quietly questioned. But on this night, something shifted. A single sentence, delivered without anger, without theatrics, landed like a warning shot across the bow of the monarchy. And suddenly, people weren't asking what had been said. They were asking why it had been said now. Because when someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding confrontation chooses to speak on live television, it's rarely spontaneous. It's rarely impulsive. And it's almost never without preparation. So let me ask you something. What would push a man raised to protect the crown at all costs, to risk exposing everything? Not behind palace doors, not through anonymous briefings, but in front of the world. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't a leak. This wasn't a tabloid headline. This was a line being drawn publicly. And according to multiple insiders, it wasn't aimed at the public at all. It was aimed at one person. For years, there had been tension beneath the surface. You could see it in the careful wording of statements, the conspicuous absences, the frozen smiles, the refusal to engage, a strategy of silence. But silence only works when the story stops growing. And it didn't. It multiplied. Claims were repeated, then reframed, then contradicted. Details shifted depending on the audience. Timelines blurred. Facts softened. And while much of the world watched emotionally, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. People were taking notes. Because institutions don't respond to emotion. They respond to patterns. And patterns, according to sources, were becoming impossible to ignore. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because this isn't about likability. It isn't about popularity. It isn't even about sympathy. It's about credibility. How many times can a version of events change before someone inside the system decides that silence is more dangerous than speaking? How many contradictions can be absorbed before they start to weaken the structure, holding everything up? And most importantly, what happens when those contradictions are no longer just public relations problems, but institutional liabilities? That's the question that reportedly began circulating behind palace walls long before the cameras ever turned on. Long before the broadcast. Long before the world realized that something was about to crack. The public saw a moment. Insiders saw a culmination. And here's the part most people don't realize. This wasn't the first time concerns had been raised. It wasn't the second. It wasn't even the third. According to those familiar with the situation, private warnings had already been issued. Conversations had already taken place. Opportunities to clarify, correct, or quietly step back had allegedly been offered. Ignored. And that's where patience reportedly ran out. Because when narratives start to harden into truth without verification, the damage becomes permanent. And when institutions built on continuity feel threatened by instability, they don't lash out emotionally. They act strategically. Which brings us back to that live broadcast. The pause before the sentence. The deliberate wording. The absence of rage. This wasn't a meltdown. This was a message. A message that said, enough. But the most shocking part wasn't the implication of consequences. It was the implication of preparation. Because no one threatens titles. No one mentions legal consequences. No one alludes to stripping privileges. Unless those options have already been discussed. And that's where public perception diverges from private reality. To the audience at home, the words sounded dramatic, even unbelievable. To those inside the system, they reportedly sounded procedural. Which raises a chilling possibility. What if this wasn't a threat at all? What if it was a warning of what was already in motion? And that's why the phrase that stunned viewers, the one that sent shockwaves across social media, may not have been chosen for shock value. It may have been chosen for precision. Because when someone says, "I will jail you," the public hears rage. But institutions hear something else. They hear jurisdiction. They hear documentation. They hear process. And suddenly, the conversation shifts from feelings to files, from interviews to evidence, from narratives to records. This is the moment where the story stops being about who said what and starts being about what can be proven. And that's why this matters now. Not because of drama, but because of timing. The monarchy is changing. Public tolerance is thinning. And credibility has become currency. In an age where everything is recorded, archived, replayed, and dissected, contradictions don't disappear. They accumulate. And when they accumulate inside an institution built on continuity and restraint, there comes a moment when silence becomes complicity. According to multiple sources, that moment had arrived. And that's why the exposure wasn't whispered. It was broadcast. But here's the twist. The most damaging part of this story may not be what was said on live television. It may be what wasn't said. Because insiders claim that what the public heard was only the surface layer, a signal, not the substance. The real substance, they say, exists elsewhere. In documents, in timelines, in records never meant to leave private archives. And that's where this story becomes far bigger than a feud. Because once institutions start preparing for containment instead of reconciliation, the endgame changes. This stops being about winning sympathy. It becomes about limiting damage. And if that's true, then the live broadcast wasn't the beginning of the conflict. It was the announcement that the conflict had entered a new phase, one where titles, privileges, and even legal frameworks are no longer theoretical talking points, but tools. Which leads to a final question that should make everyone pause. If this really was a warning shot, what forced it to happen now? Because people don't burn bridges unless they believe there's no way back. And according to whispers behind palace walls, something crossed a line so serious that silence was no longer an option. Something that hasn't been made public yet. Something that may explain why this time, the response wasn't quiet, but public. And if that's true, then what comes next won't be a rebuttal. It will be a reckoning. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous thing said on television wasn't shouted, but whispered calmly into a microphone? Because right after that broadcast ended, right after the red light blinked off and the studio audience exhaled, something far more important happened off camera. Phones lit up, doors closed. And inside the palace, according to multiple accounts, there was no confusion at all, only confirmation. This wasn't a surprise. It was a signal. Because to understand why that live moment mattered, you have to understand how rare it is for someone in that position to speak at all. For years, the strategy had been predictable. Never complain, never explain. Silence as armor. Distance as protection. Let stories burn themselves out. So when that rule was broken, people instinctively assumed emotion. Anger, frustration, loss of control. But here's the contradiction no one wants to confront. The man who spoke that night is known, almost obsessively, for restraint. He doesn't freelance. He doesn't improvise. And he doesn't speak unless the consequences have already been mapped out. Which raises a chilling possibility. What if the broadcast wasn't reactive, but scheduled? Insiders claim the appearance had been debated internally for weeks. Not whether it would happen, but how far it would go. How much would be said? How much would be implied? Because implication is everything in that world. A single sentence can do the work of 1,000 denials. And on that night, the wording wasn't emotional. It was deliberate. Measured pauses. Neutral tone. No personal insults. That's how institutions speak when they want to be understood by insiders, not audiences. So let's rewind. The broadcast opened normally. Polite questions. Familiar framing. Nothing out of the ordinary. Viewers settled in, expecting the usual careful non-answers. But then the shift. A question that should have been deflected. A moment that should have been softened. Instead, there was a pause. Not a nervous pause. A choosing pause. And then the sentence. Short. Direct. Impossible to walk back. And immediately, social media exploded. Clips were replayed. Headlines screamed. Commentators speculated wildly. Was this anger? Was this personal? Was this a mistake? But inside the system, the reaction was very different. Because people who understand power recognize something instantly. This wasn't emotional leakage. It was escalation. And escalation doesn't happen without cause. Here's what most viewers didn't notice. The sentence wasn't framed in the past tense. It wasn't framed as regret. It wasn't framed as disagreement. It was framed as consequence. And that subtle grammatical choice changed everything. Because consequences imply process. They imply documentation. They imply authority. They imply that decisions have already been discussed, even if they haven't been executed yet. That's why insiders reportedly didn't scramble to contain the fallout. They braced for the next phase. Now let's talk about why this moment froze the palace. Not because it was loud, but because it was public. Royal conflicts are usually handled privately. Quiet negotiations, carefully timed statements, controlled leaks when necessary. Public exposure is the last resort. It's what happens when private channels fail. And according to multiple sources, those channels had been breaking down for a long time. Long before the cameras. Behind closed doors, there were concerns about narratives hardening into permanent records, about claims being repeated so often that they became accepted truth without verification. And that's dangerous for an institution built on continuity. Because once history is written incorrectly, it doesn't just damage reputations, it damages legitimacy. So while the public saw drama, insiders saw risk management. And that's why the tone mattered so much. No shouting, no accusations, no emotional breakdown. Because emotion would have undermined authority. Calm, however, does the opposite. It suggests confidence. And confidence suggests backing. Which leads to a question you should be asking right now. Who would speak like that, without knowing they were protected? Because people don't go public unless they believe the system will hold. That's the part most commentary misses. This wasn't one person against another. This was an institution signaling that patience had expired. And that's why, within minutes of the broadcast ending, something else happened that never made headlines. Internal briefings began. Staff were instructed not to comment, not to clarify, not to soften. Silence, but a different kind. Not avoidance. Containment. And that tells us something crucial. When institutions panic, they overcorrect. They flood the media with denials, reassurances, distractions. None of that happened. Instead, there was a calm that bordered on unsettling, which suggests they expected the storm. And here's where the story deepens. Because this broadcast didn't come out of nowhere. In the weeks leading up to it, subtle shifts were already visible. Sources say meetings were shorter. Language became more formal. Intermediaries replaced direct communication. And when that happens, it usually means one thing. Trust has collapsed. Once trust is gone, everything becomes transactional. Every word is weighed. Every statement is archived. Every contradiction is logged. And that's when stories stop being stories and start becoming evidence. Let me ask you something. Have you noticed how narratives that once felt emotional began sounding rehearsed? How anecdotes stayed the same, but details shifted? How timelines blurred just enough to avoid direct contradiction, but not enough to eliminate doubt? That's the space where credibility erodes quietly. And according to insiders, that erosion had become impossible to ignore. Because the institution wasn't just watching interviews. They were comparing them, side by side, line by line, date by date. And when discrepancies stack up, silence stops being neutral. It becomes endorsement. Which brings us back to that live broadcast. Because the sentence that shocked viewers wasn't meant to shock them. It was meant to mark a boundary. A public boundary. And once a boundary is public, crossing it has consequences. That's why references to titles, privileges, and even legal language suddenly entered the conversation. Not as threats, but as frameworks. Frameworks are how institutions think. They don't say, "We're angry." They say, "This is no longer acceptable." And the moment something becomes unacceptable, options narrow. That's why the broadcast mattered more for what it enabled than for what it said. It enabled action. Behind the scenes, according to those familiar with the process, scenarios were already being mapped. Best case, worst case, and everything in between. Not because escalation was desired, but because it was anticipated. Because when narratives collide with records, records usually win. And that's where the fear crept in. Not public fear. Internal fear. The fear that this wouldn't end with statements and counterstatements. That it might move into audits, reviews, reclassifications. Because once credibility is questioned inside an institution, everything attached to that credibility comes under scrutiny. And that includes titles, privileges, and access, which is why that one sentence, delivered calmly, without anger, was more destabilizing than any shouted accusation could have been. It suggested that the next steps wouldn't be emotional. They would be procedural, and procedures don't care about feelings. They care about documentation, which leads us to the question no one on television asked. What documentation triggered this? Because people don't risk public escalation unless they believe they can defend it privately. And insiders insist that the broadcast wasn't the reveal. It was the preface, a signal to stop, a warning that the rules had changed. But here's the twist. According to multiple sources, that warning wasn't actually aimed at the public figure everyone assumed. It was aimed at the narrative itself, at the repetition, at the permanence, at the idea that saying something enough times makes it immune from challenge. And that's why this moment matters. Because once institutions challenge narratives publicly, they're prepared to challenge them formally. And if that happens, the story stops being about perception. It becomes about proof. But what really froze the palace wasn't the public reaction. It was the realization that this might force a response they couldn't control. Because once escalation begins, silence no longer protects anyone. It only delays the inevitable. And according to whispers inside the system, the inevitable had already been set in motion. Because what the public saw on live television was only the first layer, the visible layer. Behind it, something far heavier was shifting. Something that had been prepared quietly, methodically, and without emotion. And if that's true, then the broadcast wasn't the moment everything broke. It was the moment everyone realized how far things had already gone. But what came next didn't happen on television. It happened in private rooms, with closed files, and conversations that were never meant to leak. And those conversations would change the trajectory of everything that followed. How many times can a story change before someone inside the system decides it's no longer a misunderstanding? Because after that broadcast, the question inside palace walls wasn't who was angry. It was who had finally stopped believing. And that's where Chapter 2 begins. Because once the warning shot was fired, attention shifted away from tone and toward substance, away from emotion and toward pattern. And patterns, when examined closely, can be devastating. For years, the public had been presented with a narrative built on personal testimony, first-person accounts, emotional recollections, lived experience, powerful stuff. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like to admit. Institutions don't operate on emotion. They operate on consistency. And consistency, according to multiple insiders, was where the cracks began to show. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly. A detail that didn't quite line up with a previous interview. A timeline that shifted just enough to avoid contradiction. An anecdote retold with slightly different context depending on the audience. Individually, these moments were easy to dismiss. Stress, trauma, memory. But collectively, they began to form a pattern. And patterns are impossible to ignore once you start looking for them. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how the strongest stories rarely need to change? They don't need revision. They don't need clarification. They don't need reframing. They stand. But what happens when a story keeps evolving? Not deeper, but differently. That's when skepticism quietly enters the room. According to people familiar with internal discussions, that skepticism didn't start with hostility. It started with confusion. Staffers tasked with monitoring public narratives began flagging discrepancies. Not for punishment, but for awareness. At first, it was informal. A note here. A question there. Didn't she say something different last year? Then it became structured. Side-by-side comparisons. Archived transcripts. Date-stamped interviews. Not because anyone wanted conflict, but because credibility matters when stories become permanent record. And this is where the public perception diverges sharply from private reality. To viewers, interviews are moments. To institutions, they are data points. And when data points conflict, systems react. Here's one of the most telling contradictions insiders point to. The framing of events changed depending on context. What was once described as confusion became certainty. What was once described as oversight became intention. What was once minimized became central. Each version felt emotionally compelling. But emotionally compelling isn't the same as factually consistent. And that distinction matters enormously inside a structure built on continuity and documentation. According to sources, the turning point wasn't one big lie. It was death by 1,000 edits. Because when the same event is described 5 different ways over time, people stop asking how it felt. They start asking which version is lose those, and a title becomes hollow. And according to those familiar with internal planning, privileges were already under review. Not publicly, administratively. Who gets access to what? Who speaks for whom? Who benefits from proximity? These questions matter enormously when narratives become adversarial, because an institution cannot allow its own framework to be used against it. That's when defensive measures appear. And that's why the broadcast included language that sounded shocking to viewers, but procedural to insiders. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a boundary notice, a public acknowledgement that certain protections were no longer unconditional. And that's terrifying for anyone whose influence relies on those protections. Because once the institution stops shielding you, everything changes. Media tone shifts. Support softens. Access narrows. And suddenly, the same narrative that once found amplification finds resistance instead. Which leads to another question. Why risk public backlash by even mentioning titles? Why not keep everything quiet? The answer is simple. Because quiet no longer worked. Silence had been interpreted as weakness, as acquiescence, as acceptance. And once that interpretation takes hold publicly, correcting it privately becomes impossible. So the institution did something it hates doing. It clarified. But here's the twist. It didn't clarify details. It clarified authority. By mentioning titles, it reminded everyone who ultimately controls them. And control is the one thing the institution cannot afford to lose. This is where emotional narratives collide with structural reality. Because while the public debates fairness, the institution debates survival. And survival requires difficult decisions. Now, insiders say that behind the scenes, there were heated disagreements. Not about whether titles could be stripped, but about how far to go. Some argued for minimal action. Others argued that partial measures would only prolong the damage. And that's where the fear of precedent came in. Because once you act, you establish a standard. And standards don't just apply to one person. They apply to everyone. Which is why the institution hesitated. But hesitation has a cost. Because every day the narrative continued unchecked, it became more entrenched, more accepted, more dangerous. And that's why, eventually, the conversation shifted again. From should we to what happens if we don't? And that question produced a grim answer. If nothing changes, the institution becomes hostage to a narrative it doesn't control. And institutions do not survive that. So the possibility of stripping titles became less unthinkable. Not because of anger, but because of necessity. And once necessity enters the room, sentiment leaves. This is also where the phrase about jail, the one that stunned viewers, takes on a different meaning. Not literal incarceration, but jurisdiction, authority to act, authority to escalate beyond symbolism into systems governed by law and process. And when titles intersect with legal frameworks, things become very real, very fast. Because privileges are not just social. They can have legal implications. And losing them can expose individuals to scrutiny they were previously insulated from. That's why this moment matters so much. Because the broadcast didn't just threaten loss. It suggested exposure. Exposure to a world where the institution no longer absorbs impact. Where individuals stand alone. And that possibility changes behavior. Or it triggers retaliation. Which brings us to the emotional core of this chapter. Titles are identity. They shape how people see themselves and how others see them. Removing them isn't just administrative. It's existential. And that's why insiders feared what might happen next. Because people facing loss of identity don't respond calmly. They escalate. They defend. They counterattack. And once counterattacks begin, the conflict leaves the realm of quiet correction forever. Which means the institution had to consider not just what it would do, but how the other side would respond. And that's a dangerous calculation. Because escalation benefits no one, but retreat can look like surrender. So the institution chose a third option. Signal strength without execution. Warn without acting. At least for now. Which explains the broadcast perfectly. It was a notice, not a sentence. A reminder that titles and privileges are not weapons to be wielded against the institution itself. They are granted, and they can be withdrawn. But here's the chilling part. Once that reminder is given publicly, it cannot be unheard. It hangs in the air. It changes the stakes. And from that moment forward, every interview, every statement, every appearance becomes a potential trigger. Because now, the rules are visible. And breaking visible rules has visible consequences. Which leads us to the question that ends this chapter. If titles and privileges were placed on the table, If authority was asserted publicly, if containment replaced reconciliation, what happens when warnings stop being enough? Because the institution didn't escalate to this point to bluff. And if behavior doesn't change, the next move won't be symbolic. It will be structural. And once structure moves, there's no undo button. But what came next wasn't the stripping of titles. It was something quieter, something legal, something that made even seasoned advisors uneasy. Because the next phase wouldn't be about status. It would be about jurisdiction. And that's where this story takes a far darker turn. Chapter 4 complete. Go. When a royal says the word jail. Are they threatening, warning, or quietly changing the rules of the game? Because that single word did more than shock viewers. It reframed the entire conflict. And that's where Chapter 5 begins. Up to that point, everything had lived in a familiar space. Public image, titles, privilege, reputation. Serious, yes, but still symbolic. Then came that word, jail. And suddenly, the conversation jumped tracks. Because whether people believed it or not didn't matter. What mattered was that it had been said at all. Let me ask you something. Why would someone whose entire role depends on restraint choose a word that explosive, unless they were deliberately signaling something else? Because insiders insist that the phrase wasn't emotional. It was calculated, and that's what made it so unsettling. To the public, it sounded like rage, like a line crossed, like something said in the heat of the moment. But inside institutional circles, the reaction was very different. They didn't hear a threat. They heard a boundary marker. Because in that world, jail doesn't mean punishment. It means jurisdiction. It means process. It means systems that operate independently of emotion. It means things are no longer being handled quietly or informally. And that's a terrifying shift. Because once legal language enters the conversation, narrative control evaporates. Courts don't care about interviews. They don't care about tone. They don't care about public sympathy. They care about evidence. So when that word appeared, it wasn't heard as an attack. It was heard as a warning that certain protections might no longer apply. And that's a very different message. Here's where most commentary goes wrong. They assume the statement was literal, as if someone could simply decide to send another person to prison. That's not how any of this works. But that's also not what insiders believe was being communicated. The message wasn't "you're going to jail." The message was, this is no longer just a public relations matter. And that's huge. Because once something stops being PR, it enters a realm where stories can be tested, verified, challenged. And that's exactly what institutions prepare for long before they ever say the word out loud. According to those familiar with internal discussions, legal exposure had already been quietly assessed, not to prosecute, but to understand risk. Risk to the institution if certain claims were later found to be inaccurate. Risk if statements made publicly conflicted with documented reality. Risk if silence was interpreted as endorsement. And when those risks reach a certain threshold, legal frameworks aren't optional. They're inevitable. Now let's talk about why the word landed so hard. Because it pierced the emotional narrative. Up to that moment, the story had been framed around feelings. Hurt, isolation, injustice. Those are powerful shields. But legality doesn't operate on feeling. It operates on fact. And the moment jail was mentioned, it suggested a shift from subjective experience to objective scrutiny, which is why reactions were so extreme. Some people dismissed it as ridiculous. Others saw it as cruelty. But insiders saw it as something else entirely. They saw it as a signal that informal tolerance was ending, that narratives would no longer be protected simply because they were emotionally compelling. And that's terrifying for anyone whose credibility depends on perception rather than documentation. Let me ask you this. Why would an institution risk backlash by invoking legal consequences unless it believed it could defend that position? Because you don't introduce that language unless you're prepared for what follows. Legal scrutiny cuts both ways. Once invited, it doesn't discriminate. It examines everyone, which is why institutions avoid it at all costs, unless the alternative is worse. And insiders insist the alternative had become unacceptable. Because contradictions weren't just public. They were recorded. Statements existed in multiple versions. Claims conflicted with timelines. Assertions clashed with corroborated accounts. And while none of that automatically equals wrongdoing, it creates vulnerability. Vulnerability to challenge. Vulnerability to inquiry. Vulnerability to being asked questions that can't be answered emotionally. And that's where legal exposure becomes relevant. Not as punishment, as process. Now here's the contradiction that unsettled even senior advisors. The person who spoke that night didn't elaborate. No explanation. No list of accusations. No specifics. Just that word. Jail. Why? Because specificity invites rebuttal. Vagueness invites caution. It forces the other side to consider what the speaker might know, not what the public knows. And that's a powerful psychological move. It shifts fear from the audience to the subject. Because if you don't know what someone is referring to, you don't know how to respond. And insiders say that uncertainty was intentional, not to intimidate publicly, but to provoke private reconsideration. A moment of pause, a chance to stop. Because once legal processes begin, they don't stop. They escalate. They expand. They uncover things no one planned to expose. And institutions know this better than anyone. That's why they avoid that road, unless they believe they've reached the end of every other one. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Could anyone actually be jailed over this? The answer isn't simple. It's not about one interview or one statement. It's about accumulation, repeated claims, potential misrepresentations, statements made under different jurisdictions, commercial ventures tied to narratives. That's where legal vulnerability can emerge. Not from emotion, from inconsistency. And once money, contracts, or official representations intersect with disputed narratives, things get complicated very quickly, which is why that word mattered. It wasn't about punishment. It was about warning that lines were being crossed into regulated territory. And once that happens, oversight increases, scrutiny follows, and protections thin. This is also why the broadcast didn't come with immediate action. No announcements, no follow-up statements, just silence. A different kind of silence. Not avoidance, anticipation. And that silence told insiders something critical. The institution wasn't bluffing. If it were bluffing, it would have tried to reassure, to soften, to clarify. Instead, it did nothing, which suggests it was prepared for what might come next. Now consider the emotional impact on the other side. Imagine hearing that word and realizing that the conflict may no longer be winnable through interviews or public sympathy. That the arena might be changing, from public opinion to process, from narratives to evidence. That realization can provoke two very different responses: retreat or escalation. And insiders feared escalation. Because once legal language enters a public feud, both sides risk losing control. And that's why this moment was so dangerous, because it created a fork in the road. One path leads to de-escalation, quiet adjustments, fewer claims, lower volume. The other leads to confrontation, more interviews, more allegations, more pressure. And once that path is chosen, the institution is forced to respond. Not emotionally, procedurally. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of this chapter. According to whispers inside the system, legal teams were already involved, not to prosecute, but to prepare. Prepare for inquiries. Prepare for challenges. Prepare for the possibility that silence would no longer be defensible. That's what the word jail really signaled. Readiness. Readiness to let systems do what narratives could not. And that's a terrifying prospect for anyone whose story relies on flexibility. Because courts don't allow revision. They don't allow reinterpretation. They don't allow contradictions to coexist. They demand clarity. And clarity exposes weaknesses, which is why this moment marked a turning point. Before, everything could be framed as opinion. After, everything risked becoming fact-checked. And once fact-checking begins formally, outcomes become unpredictable, even for the institution itself. That's why this wasn't said lightly. And that's why it wasn't repeated. One word was enough, because everyone who needed to understand it did. And that's why the days following the broadcast were so quiet. No immediate response. No dramatic counterattack. Just a recalibration. Because both sides suddenly understood something had changed. The battlefield was no longer emotional. It was structural. And that's when fear entered the equation. Not public fear. Private fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of loss of control. Fear that escalation would trigger mechanisms no one could stop. And that fear would soon shape the next phase of this conflict. Because once legal frameworks hover over a narrative, the next moves become high risk. Every word becomes evidence. Every appearance becomes a liability. And the institution knew this, which is why the next step wasn't another speech. It was observation. Watching. Waiting. letting the other side reveal their strategy. Because once someone shows how they plan to respond, you know how to proceed. And according to insiders, what they saw next confirmed their worst fears. Because instead of retreat, a counter-narrative was being prepared. And that counter-narrative would push this conflict into full-blown narrative warfare. One that could no longer be contained quietly. But what came next wouldn't unfold in courtrooms or palaces. It would explode in the media. And once that happened, there would be no going back. Chapter 5 complete. Go. What happens when truth stops being debated and starts being weaponized? Because the moment that word landed, jail, the conflict didn't slow down. It multiplied. And that's where Chapter 6 begins. This is the phase where stories stop being told and start being fought over. Narrative warfare, the most dangerous kind. Because unlike private warnings or institutional signals, media battles don't have rules. They don't have referees. And once they begin, they feed on emotion, outrage, and speed. And speed favors whoever speaks first, not whoever is right. In the hours after that broadcast, the media landscape shifted violently. Headlines didn't ask questions. They made declarations. Some framed the moment as cruelty. Others framed it as overdue accountability. Some called it a power play. Others called it a meltdown. And that's the first sign of narrative warfare. When the same event produces completely incompatible truths. One audience saw a bully. Another saw a protector. Another saw a system cracking under pressure. And the institution knew exactly what that meant. Control was slipping. Because once the media fractures into camps, facts become secondary to allegiance. That's when narratives become weapons. And suddenly, everyone had a version of the story, except the institution itself, which stayed silent. And silence in a media storm is interpreted in only two ways: guilt or confidence. There is no neutral silence. So commentators rushed to fill the void. Former allies turned cautious. Former critics turned emboldened. New voices emerged claiming inside knowledge. Everyone wanted to define the moment before someone else did. Because in narrative warfare, the first version sticks hardest. And that's exactly what advisors feared. Not because the truth couldn't survive scrutiny, but because truth moves slowly and outrage moves fast. And outrage was everywhere. Social media exploded with clips stripped of context. Reactions layered on reactions. Anger feeding anger. But here's what most people didn't notice. The institution didn't correct a single misinterpretation. Not one. No clarifications. No denials. No walkbacks. That wasn't an oversight. It was strategy. Because correcting narratives requires engaging them. And engaging them legitimizes them. Instead, the institution watched. Tracked sentiment. Monitored tone. Mapped alliances. Because in any information war, the first phase isn't response. It's intelligence gathering. Who is amplifying what? Which outlets are framing it how? Where is sympathy consolidating? Where is skepticism emerging? These questions matter more than outrage. Because outrage is loud, but fleeting. Sentiment is quiet and durable. And here's where things got interesting. While the loudest voices framed the moment as cruelty or overreach, a different current began forming underneath. A quieter one. People started rewatching interviews. Comparing statements. Not to attack, but to understand. And once people begin comparing, narratives weaken. Because narratives rely on momentum, not inspection. And inspection was spreading. Which is why the media response wasn't uniform. Yes, there were dramatic headlines. But there were also hesitant ones. Careful phrasing. Conditional language. Alleged. Reported. Those words matter. They signal doubt. And doubt is deadly to storytelling. The institution noticed this shift immediately. Because it confirmed something crucial. The public was no longer consuming the narrative passively. They were interrogating it. And that's when narrative warfare enters its second phase. Counter-narratives. Within days, familiar themes resurfaced. Victimhood. Persecution. Historical grievances. The story was reframed as an attack by power against vulnerability. A classic move. And emotionally, it works. Because people instinctively protect those they perceive as underdogs. But here's the contradiction insiders found alarming. The counter-narrative didn't address inconsistencies. It bypassed them. Instead of clarifying facts, it escalated emotion. Instead of reconciling timelines, it expanded grievances. The strategy wasn't to correct. It was to overwhelm. Flood the space with feeling so that scrutiny gets drowned out. That's a common tactic in narrative warfare, and it can be very effective. But it has a cost. Because the more emotion you inject, the less flexibility you retain. Once you commit to a narrative emotionally, backing down becomes betrayal, not adjustment. And that locks everyone in. Which is why advisors grew increasingly uneasy. Because escalation in media almost always forces escalation institutionally. The two feed each other. And the institution was now being pulled into a fight it had tried desperately to avoid. Let me ask you something. Why would anyone escalate publicly after being warned privately? There are only two answers. They believe they're untouchable, or they believe escalation is their only protection. Neither is reassuring. Now here's where the media response became chaotic. Different outlets began sourcing palace insiders, often unnamed, often contradictory. One report claimed panic. Another claimed calm. Another claimed division. And all of them claimed authority, which tells you something important. Information was leaking, not official statements. Impressions, opinions, interpretations. That's the most dangerous kind of leak, because it creates the illusion of transparency while actually increasing confusion. And confusion benefits only one side. The side willing to speak the loudest. Meanwhile, the institution continued doing something that looked passive but wasn't. It refused to react emotionally. No interviews. No anonymous rebuttals. No narrative counterpunches. That silence frustrated commentators. Why won't they respond? But insiders knew exactly why. Because reacting would mean choosing a narrative prematurely. And once chosen, narratives are hard to abandon. Instead, the institution let the media burn itself out. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The tone shifted. Not everywhere, but enough to matter. Some commentators began asking uncomfortable questions. Why hadn't certain claims been addressed directly? Why had timelines shifted over the years? Why were contradictions never clarified? These weren't hostile questions. They were analytical. And analysis is dangerous for emotionally driven narratives. Because analysis removes urgency. It replaces outrage with curiosity. And curiosity invites investigation. That's the last thing any narrative war wants. Because investigation doesn't take sides. It takes notes. And the moment that shift began, advisors recognized it as an opportunity. Not to attack, but to let gravity do its work. Truth doesn't need amplification if it's allowed to surface. But it does need space. And the institution was creating that space by not filling it with noise. Meanwhile, on the other side, the pressure to respond grew. Silence began to feel like vulnerability. And that's when escalation became tempting. More interviews, more appearances, more emotional appeals. Each one designed to reclaim control. But each one also added new material to the record. New statements, new phrasing, new details. And with each addition, the risk increased. Because consistency becomes harder to maintain the longer a story continues, especially under pressure. And pressure was mounting. Public sympathy, once automatic, became conditional. Not gone, but cautious. Support softened. Questions lingered. And the institution noticed something critical. The narrative was no longer dominating. It was fragmenting. Fragmentation is the beginning of collapse. Because once a story fractures, it becomes impossible to defend holistically. You end up defending pieces. And pieces can be isolated. Which is exactly what began to happen. Clips circulated showing side-by-side contradictions. Not aggressively. Almost neutrally. Here's what was said then. Here's what's being said now. No commentary. Just comparison. That's devastating. Because it doesn't provoke outrage. It provokes doubt. And doubt spreads quietly. Meanwhile, media outlets that had once framed the story emotionally began hedging. Language softened. Certainty eroded. And that's when insiders realized something profound. The narrative war wasn't being won by whoever shouted loudest. It was being won by whoever said least. Because silence allowed scrutiny to focus outward instead of inward. And scrutiny was no longer focused on the institution. It was shifting, which is why the next phase terrified everyone involved. Because once scrutiny shifts away from power, it lands on individuals. And individuals don't have institutional buffers. They don't have layers of advisors. They don't have centuries of precedent. They have statements. And statements can be compared. This is where media warfare becomes personal. where credibility stops being abstract, where trust is tested line by line. And that's exactly what was beginning. Behind the scenes, advisors warned that escalation now would be dangerous. Every appearance risked contradiction. Every response risked validation of scrutiny. But momentum is hard to stop once it starts. And fear drives escalation. Fear of losing the narrative. Fear of appearing guilty. Fear of silence being misinterpreted. And fear makes people talk. That's the trap. Because talking feels like control. But under scrutiny, it's exposure. Which brings us to the moment this chapter ends. Because according to insiders, while the media fought loudly in public, something else was happening quietly. A shift far more consequential than headlines. Requests were being made. Not for interviews. Not for statements. For records. Clarifications. Timelines. Things that don't belong in media wars at all. Things that belong somewhere else. And once those requests began circulating, even the loudest voices went quiet. Because everyone involved understood what that meant. This was no longer about winning public opinion. It was about surviving verification. And once verification enters the picture, narrative warfare becomes irrelevant. Because facts don't fight. They expose. But what came next would move this story out of the media entirely, and into a place where narratives don't matter at all. And that's when the real fear set in. What if the most dangerous weapon in this entire conflict was paper? Not rumors. Not interviews. Not even live television. Paper. Because once narrative warfare reached its peak, something shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly. And that's where Chapter 7 begins. This is the moment the story leaves emotion behind. This is where it enters the realm of receipts. According to insiders, the requests that began circulating weren't dramatic. They weren't public, and they weren't accusatory. They were administrative. Clarifications. Timelines. Confirmations. The kind of requests that don't show up in headlines, but decide outcomes. Because when institutions stop debating stories and start reviewing records, the conversation changes completely. Let me ask you something. Why would anyone fear documentation unless they weren't sure it would align with what had been said? That's the question that haunted advisors as this phase began. Because documentation doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It doesn't persuade. It simply exists. And existence is hard to challenge. Here's what insiders say triggered this shift. As media narratives fragmented and scrutiny intensified, internal teams began doing something quietly but relentlessly. They assembled timelines. Not based on memory. Not based on interviews. Based on records. Travel logs. Schedules. Correspondence. Archived communications. The goal wasn't to disprove anyone publicly. It was to understand risk. Risk of contradiction. Risk of misrepresentation. Risk of future exposure. Because once a narrative is monetized, repeated, and institutionalized, inconsistencies stop being personal. They become liabilities. And that's where receipts enter the picture. According to those familiar with the process, the first comparisons were unsettling. Events described as spontaneous overlapped with pre-existing commitments. Moments framed as isolated didn't align with documented patterns. Statements that implied ignorance conflicted with emails suggesting awareness. Individually, none of this proved wrongdoing. But collectively, it raised questions. And questions invite review. This is the part of the story most audiences never hear. Because it's not dramatic. It's methodical. Teams cross-referencing dates. Flagging discrepancies. Asking whether explanations existed. Not accusations. Inquiries. And inquiries are far more dangerous. Because they don't need intent to proceed. They only need inconsistency. Now here's where fear entered the room. Not public fear. Internal fear. Fear that the narrative had grown faster than the documentation could support. Fear that repetition had replaced verification. Fear that silence had allowed assumptions to harden into perceived facts. And once those fears crystallize, institutions do something very specific. They preserve records. Everything. Not because they expect a confrontation, but because they prepare for one. That preparation alone changes behavior. Language becomes careful. Access narrows. Advisors insist on written communication. Why? Because written records outlive narratives. And according to insiders, that shift happened fast. Suddenly, conversations that had once been informal required follow-ups. Verbal assurances were replaced by emails. Ambiguity became unacceptable. And this was deeply unsettling to those accustomed to flexibility. Because flexibility thrives in gray areas. Documentation destroys gray areas. Let me put it this way. Stories can adapt. Records cannot. And that's why the paper trail became the most sensitive element in this entire saga. Because it didn't just challenge one claim. It challenged coherence. Now, to be clear, no one is claiming that a single smoking gun existed. That's not how institutional reviews work. They don't look for explosions. They look for erosion. Small gaps. Unanswered questions. Moments where narratives lean heavily on emotion because facts are thin. And when enough of those moments accumulate, the foundation weakens. That's what insiders describe. A slow realization that some stories had been told too often to be revised, but not consistently enough to be verified. And once that realization sets in, a decision has to be made. Do you ignore the discrepancies and hope scrutiny fades? Or do you prepare for the possibility that scrutiny intensifies? Institutions always choose preparation, because hope isn't a strategy. And that's when the requests went out, quietly, to third parties, to partners, to entities connected to certain claims. Nothing accusatory, just confirmation, dates, attendance, awareness, the kinds of questions that feel harmless, unless you're unsure of the answers. This is also where tone began to change dramatically. People who had spoken freely grew cautious. Statements became shorter, responses slower. Because once documentation enters the equation, every word becomes permanent, and permanent words carry risk. Now let's talk about why this phase terrified even seasoned advisors. Because documentation doesn't just examine what was said, it examines what was omitted. Silence becomes meaningful, gaps become visible, and those gaps raise uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't this mentioned earlier? Why did this detail appear later? Why does this version contradict earlier statements? Again, none of this proves malice, but it does undermine certainty. And certainty is the backbone of credibility. Here's another contradiction insiders point to. Some claims were presented as deeply personal, too personal to be questioned. But once those claims intersected with institutional processes, they became subject to verification. Not because anyone wanted to invade privacy, but because those claims had been used to justify decisions, narratives, and public positions. Once personal stories shape institutional outcomes, they stop being purely personal. They become part of the record, and records must be accurate. That's the moment where emotional immunity disappears. And that moment is terrifying, because it means sincerity is no longer enough. You need consistency. Now consider how this felt from the other side. Imagine realizing that years of interviews, statements, and storytelling were now being examined not by fans or critics, but by analysts. People trained to look for alignment. People who don't care about tone. People who only care about whether things line up. That realization changes everything, because it means the game has changed. No more reframing. No more emotional resets. No more "that's not what I meant." Records don't interpret intention. They reflect sequence. And sequence tells a story whether you want it to or not. That's why insiders describe this phase as the point of no return. Not because consequences were immediate, but because the illusion of control evaporated. Once records are assembled, the outcome becomes less about narrative skill and more about factual alignment. And alignment, in this case, was uneven. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Does documentation automatically mean guilt? No, absolutely not. But it does mean vulnerability. Vulnerability to challenge. Vulnerability to exposure. Vulnerability to being asked questions that don't have satisfying answers. And vulnerability is dangerous when you've built credibility on certainty, because certainty doesn't coexist well with revision. Now here's the most unsettling part of this chapter. According to insiders, some of the discrepancies weren't about major events. They were about small details. Dates off by days. Sequences reversed. Awareness implied before it could have existed. These are the kinds of inconsistencies that don't matter until they do, because small errors suggest either poor memory or strategic storytelling. And when those errors appear repeatedly, reviewers begin to ask why. Why wasn't this corrected? Why did this version persist? Why did no one clarify? And that brings us back to silence. Because silence that once looked dignified now looked risky. Risky because it allowed inaccuracies to solidify. Risky because it could be interpreted later as endorsement. That's why documentation triggered such anxiety. Not because it proved anything, but because it threatened to. And once that threat exists, institutions act to protect themselves. They don't attack. They distance. Access is reduced. Associations reconsidered. Privileges quietly reviewed. Because institutions don't wait for certainty. They act on probability. And the probability, according to internal assessments, was no longer comfortable. Which brings us to a chilling realization. By the time the public was still debating headlines, the real story had already moved on. It had moved into files, folders, databases, places the public never sees. And once a story enters those spaces, it stops being emotional. It becomes administrative. That's the moment where outcomes begin to crystallize quietly. No drama, no announcements, just adjustments. And that's why some insiders say the most damaging thing wasn't the broadcast. It was what followed in silence. The assembling of records, the cross-checking of claims, the realization that narratives and documentation were no longer aligned. Because alignment can be fixed, but misalignment invites action. And action, once triggered, doesn't announce itself. It unfolds. Which is why this chapter ends on a sobering note. The receipts weren't released. They weren't leaked. They weren't weaponized. They were archived. And archiving is a form of readiness. Readiness for scrutiny. Readiness for inquiry. Readiness for a future moment when silence would no longer be defensible. And according to whispers behind the scenes, that future moment was already being anticipated. Because once documentation exists, it waits, patiently, for the right trigger. And the next trigger wouldn't come from the institution. It would come from emotion, from fear, from a move that would force those records into relevance. And when that happened, everything would escalate at once. But what came next wasn't exposure. It was something far more personal, something that made this conflict stop being abstract and start being deeply, uncomfortably human. What happens when a conflict stops being about institutions and becomes about legacy? Because by the time documentation entered the picture, this story was no longer abstract. It was no longer theoretical. It was personal. And that's where Chapter 8 begins. This is the part most people misunderstand. They assume the escalation was driven by anger, ego, or public pressure. But insiders insist the real catalyst was something far quieter and far heavier. Responsibility. Because when you strip away the noise, the interviews, the outrage, and the headlines, you're left with one unavoidable reality. Some people don't have the luxury of being wrong. They inherit consequences. And that weight changes everything. Let me ask you something. How does someone raised to protect an institution respond when they believe that institution is being slowly undermined? Not by enemies, but by contradictions. Not attacked from the outside, eroded from within. That's the emotional core of this chapter. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about protecting a future. According to those close to the situation, the internal shift wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Years of restraint. Years of silence. Years of absorbing criticism without response. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying nothing felt safer than escalating. Until it didn't. Because at a certain point, silence stops being noble. It becomes negligent. And that realization is brutal. Especially for someone who has spent their entire life being told that restraint is strength. Because restraint only works when others are also restrained. When one side stops playing by those rules, the imbalance becomes dangerous. This is where the conflict became deeply personal. Not emotionally reactive, but existential. Because legacy isn't about reputation today. It's about what survives tomorrow. And insiders say that fear. Fear of being remembered as the one who let something unravel weighed heavily. He wasn't reacting as a brother-in-law. He wasn't reacting as a public figure. He was reacting as a future custodian. And custodians think differently. They don't ask, how does this look now? They ask, what does this create later? Because later is where accountability lives. Now let's talk about the pressure few people acknowledge. Every generation inherits not just power, but unresolved problems. And the most dangerous ones are the problems everyone hoped would resolve themselves. According to those familiar with private conversations, there was a growing sense that avoidance had failed, that hoping the narrative would burn out had backfired, that repetition had turned claims into perceived truths. And perceived truths, once entrenched, become extremely difficult to dislodge, which leads to a terrifying prospect. What if future historians treat these narratives as fact because no one challenged them when they could? That's not just embarrassing. It's permanent. And permanence is what institutions fear most. Because institutions survive by controlling continuity.